Do you know there's a surprising number of household items that are actually watercolour supplies in disguise? We do all love a bit of art supplies shopping, to be sure, but it's also nice to feel thrifty and resourceful and use up what you've already got in your house. I bet you've got most of these things already. Let's check. If you're a fan of the clean white border, I'm sure you've tried taping your paper to a board and used something like a painter's tape or an artist's tape. These are low-tack tapes that are specifically sold for this purpose, that they will be easy to remove. Now, did you know that packing tape, you know, the kind that you use to seal those big cardboard boxes when you're moving house, that sort of tape will do pretty much the same job. And I quite like that it's a little bit wider. I have to say, it did blow my mind and took quite a leap of faith for me to believe that this was going to come off cleanly, but it usually does. And if you're wondering what board I've used, this is actually an old chopping board that I've repurposed. Something I used to chop vegetables in a previous life. I've given a new job in the studio to be the support for some of these paintings that I'm choosing to tape up. I must be honest, I don't do this taping very often, but that's just because I'm a bit of an impatient painter who wants to get on with things, and it does require a bit of a test of my patience to carefully tape down all these edges. But if you've ever peeled off the tape and revealed that clean white border, you'll know that that satisfaction is often worth the effort. Now, there's a clue in the name of watercolor paint, and that is that one of the key ingredients is going to be water, which means you do need some sort of a receptacle for your water. And you can buy a fit-for-purpose jar. Often there's little travel water containers for people who like to do plein air watercolor and that sort of thing. But when you're at home in the studio, really, you can use just about anything. And actually, I would recommend looking for two containers. My favorite is pickle jars. I do have a fondness for these pickles, so I have an almost endless supply of them. And as I say, I like to use two because I like to have one available to swish my brush in. And you can see this is also why it's quite handy to have a big one, because you want to be able to shake your brush around and push it against the side. You want to have lots of room to do that and lots of water. So I wouldn't go for those tiny little pots. I don't think they're useful at all. I would look for a nice big jar and have one that you can keep with clean water, because clean water is very useful throughout the painting process. And if we know it's important to be able to add water, you actually also are in a very good position if you've got something to help you take away the water. I like to use these kitchen rolls. They're super absorbent, and I've always got some on hand. But if you have an old t-shirt or any sort of old fabric that you can cut up and turn into a cloth, that's going to work perfectly well as well. All you need is something that's going to help you dry off your brush. Maybe something that you can use to do a little bit of blotting. So whether it's a cloth or a paper towel is entirely up to you, but there's sure to be something in your house that you're going to be able to use right now. By the way, if you are wondering what sort of things you do actually need from the art supplies shop, I do have a free supplies guide that I will link in the description below, because it does show you exactly what you need and what you can save your money on. It also comes with a free bonus course that talks about every single one of the supplies that you might need, so that you're properly informed when you go into the art supply store. Now, whether you go for watercolor tubes or watercolor pans, you probably will get to the stage where you want a little bit more mixing area. Now, if you have a palette, something like this one, you do have extra palette mixing area built into it, but sometimes that's not enough. And as I say, if you've just got a whole set of tubes, you might not have a palette at all. You can buy a palette, something like this. You get square ones, that sort of thing. They're not particularly expensive, but you actually don't really need them. If you've got an old white ceramic plate, or this one is one of those picnicware kind of plasticky ones, that'll do just fine, because all you need is something that's going to take the paint, and I would go for a white because that's what I'm used to, or if you've got a kind of a grayish color, some painters prefer that, but because we paint with watercolor paint onto white watercolor paper, I prefer to have the same white base in my palette so I can see what color I'm mixing, because it's going to transfer quite well to the paper, whereas oil painters often tend to like a grey sort of mid-toned palette. But up to you, and you can experiment. See what you've got at home, use whatever plates you have to hand, and you'll have plenty of mixing area available to you without having to go and spend money on a separate palette. One of the things I like to do before I start painting is to spritz a little bit of water over my dry palette to bring those paints back to life. You can get a mister bottle in the art shop, you know, a little spray bottle. You can get them in different sizes and you can get them with different nozzles, but you can find the same thing in the supermarket or the grocery store. You can also find them in the gardening shop. But my favorite place to find them is just in the recycling bin. I've got an old, this was some sort of hairspray, I think, that I finished and emptied, washed out, and now it just has water in it. And I use this to spritz over my palette before I start painting. I also will use it to keep the wash wet, sometimes during painting. If I want to make sure things stay damp, you can just use your little spray bottle to do that. So you might want to have a look around the house next time you're throwing out one of these spray bottles in the recycling bin. Just check what sort of spray it's got, because you might find you've got one that's nice and strong and you've got one that's got a very dispersed spray, and that might be handy to have a couple of different ones to get different effects with the water. Now, if you want to put a little bit of fun into your painting, there are a few household items that you can add that interact with the paint to create lovely effects. The one I'm using right now is alcohol. I happen to have a bottle of pure alcohol on hand, and I'm using that. But of course, if you had something like a little spot of vodka in the cupboard, you can use a little drop of that to create the same effect. What the alcohol is doing is spreading very fast as it hits the paper and pushing all of the pigments, the watercolor pigments, out into a little ring, creating these lovely little dandelion halo effects. So much fun to watch that happen on the page. And since we're in the kitchen, there are a few other things that you're going to find in there that you can add to create some other interesting effects. I like to keep a little jar of table salt in this tiny container. This had edible glitter in it, I think. So that's another food item I've repurposed, just the little container. But this is just regular old salt. It is this kind of table salt. And I like to add that if I want to create a little bit of crystalline texture in something I'm painting. I often use it for things like gravel paths, and I've used it before to create feathery texture in chickens, which is something we painted together in my Happy Painters Hub membership. I'll pop the link in the description in case that's something you'd like to check out. The other handy kitchen item that creates fascinating textures in your watercolor is plastic wrap. So I sometimes take a little sheet of plastic wrap and press it into a very wet, juicy wash and let the wash dry with all the little wrinkles and crinkles that I can create, pushing the plastic around with my fingers. You let that dry completely, and then when you come back the next day, or at least in a couple of hours, and pull the cling film off, you will have lots of very interesting marks that you probably couldn't create any other way, that you can use either as interesting background or to inspire your painting, because you can use some of those shapes and see what you can find in them. A bit like that game we used to play when we were kids, looking at the clouds and seeing what shapes we could see. You do the same thing with the shapes that have been created in your plastic wrap and see if you can turn it into a flower or something else. I've got another video that shows you exactly how I did that with hydrangeas, and I'll pop that one in the cards in case you'd like to watch that next. But before we leave the kitchen, do you have an old birthday candle hanging around? Or maybe even one of those regular taper candles? It's ideal if it's a white candle, because this is something that I like to use as a resist. You can buy wax resist crayons. You know, they're purpose built, and it just is a plain wax crayon with no pigment in it. And it's very useful because you can put down a little bit of this wax and it will protect the page, protect the white, which is a way of instantly preserving your whites. Now, the downside to this is that you can never remove that wax. So you have to be very confident with the mark you're putting down, and less is usually more with this technique. But I find this so much better than masking fluid. That's a whole separate video I think I need to make. But wax is something that I do really enjoy using because it creates lovely textures and is a nice way of making sure that if there's a highlight that you do want to preserve, that you can do that quite easily and also in a quite natural organic mark, whereas something like masking fluid usually leaves you with this horrible, this very unnatural looking sharp edge. Something else you might have lying around is an old credit card or an old store card, and those you can actually cut into something that can replace a palette knife. Of course, you can buy a set of palette knives and they all have slightly different shapes. You can get really pointy, sharp ones, you can get slightly rounded ones, but if you take your scissors and your old card, not your new card, and use the scissors just to cut the shapes that you're looking for, you can create your own version of a palette knife. It's not going to have a handle, but I actually like that better. I find it a little bit more fun to use, and you're much closer to the work somehow. I don't know why, but I rather enjoy that. And I'm using the edge, a very sharp edge of the credit card, to scratch little marks into my strawberries that could suggest the seeds. I don't want to sit and paint a whole lot of seeds, but I could just scratch a few little marks and they might suggest them. If you're wanting to paint fine lines, telephone lines, something like that, or cat's whiskers, that sort of thing that needs a very fine mark, you can sometimes do by scratching out, either with a craft knife or with something like this craft knife that you've created out of a credit card, just the scratchy tip. Now, it would be unfair of me to tease you with the idea of that clean white border reveal and not show it to you. So let me do that. But there's one more household item that we could talk about at this point, and that is the hairdryer. You can get a craft gun or a heat gun from the art store, and those are quite useful if you're impatient when it comes to the drying and you want something to speed that process up. Your hairdryer will do just as well. I try to avoid doing this because I think you get nicer washes if you just let the wash dry naturally and let the pigments settle where they may. Sometimes with the hairdryer it can be a bit of a strong blast and it can push the pigments in a way that they might not have settled if you just left them alone to dry by themselves. But the other time that the heat gun or the hairdryer is quite handy is just before you remove the tape. You can run the hairdryer over it and that will soften up the glue and make it even easier to remove. But you can see pulling off the tape is something that is awfully satisfying to do. Is it worth the effort? Every so often I think it is. Now that we've been all thrifty and resourceful, using up what we do have around the house, I bet you want to know what you should be spending your money on when you go to the arts supply store. I think the most important supply is paper, and I made a video all about that. I'm going to link it up in the card so you can watch that one next.